Welcome, everybody. Welcome to this event in the framework of the Geneva Toxic-Free Talks. And thank you for all of you who are following us here in the room and online, and some of you are following since the beginning of the events yesterday. So this is absolutely great. So as you probably noticed with the event we had just a few hours ago, which was devoted to agroecology versus agrotoxics, we wanted to devote this day to a number of alternatives. Of course, here in the Human Rights Council, when we're talking about the impacts of toxics, we're focusing on all of the negative aspects, unfortunately, that we have to deal with when we're using toxic substances and wastes. But of course, in order to respond to these challenges, it's also very important to see what are the different and possible paths. And there are some. Quite a lot, actually, and unfortunately, not always promoted to the level that they should be. So it's important to always include the question of alternatives when we're dealing with these issues of human rights and toxics. And so for the second event of this day, devoted precisely to the alternatives, we're very happy to have a discussion with a number of three experts, particularly relevant on how do we find and how we promote alternatives with the industry, with the states, and for all of the users. And also then to turn to see how within the industry we can make sure that workers are protected. And there is an interesting concept which is now shifting from climate change to the area of toxics, which is a just transition for the workers in the chemical field. So these are the issues we're going to talk about during this event. And before I turn to our panelists, let me turn to the Special Rapporteur, Marco Solana, for perhaps just a few words of introduction before we get to the panel.
Thank you very much, Yves, and please allow me, as in other occasions, to first thank the Geneva Environment Network and Earth Justice for the collaboration in organizing the Geneva Toxic-Free Talks. The topic of this session is, of course, critical to millions of people around the world. The workers are often in the fence line, in the first line of exposure to hazardous substances and wastes. The recognition of the right to a healthy environment by the General Assembly last year, and the recognition by the ILO of the right to work in a healthy environment, the safe working conditions, as a fundamental right and principle of the International Labour Organization need to be underlined, because they provide the basis upon which the protections of workers in regards to toxics can be taken forward. I want to recall the work done by my predecessor in implementing a rights-based approach to chemicals and wastes, and preparing, after extensive consultations, a set of principles on workers and toxics. These principles have been taken note of. They have been embraced to some extent by the Human Rights Council. They contain important elements such as the right to know, important issues of protections. In my country visits, I make it a point to meet with labor unions whenever I have the chance, and I've received a significant amount of information, for example, on workers exposed in the PFAS production, or with respect to highly hazardous products. Recently in Australia, in regards to silica and asbestos and tar. So there are new issues that are coming up all the time. But I want to echo, and this is my last opening thought, the point that you made, Eve, in the opening, that a just transition is a cross-cutting issue for human rights, and it's not absent from the toxics debates. It was born in the climate space, but it has implications for every industry that in order to transition to environmentally sound, real environmental sustainability, the workers that maybe need retraining or will be displaced by the phase out of what can be considered dirty industries. This is a key point in order to for these transitions to be legitimate and effective. So I want to stress that as well, and welcome this panel very much. Thank you for this opening.
Thank you very much, Marcus. Marcus, you just mentioned your predecessor, Professor Bashkut Tunçak. Well, we're very happy to have with us to introduce this general issue of alternative, the Deputy Director of the TURI, which is the Toxic Use Reduction Institute based at the University of Massachusetts, Lowell. It's a very well-known institute providing assistance and trainings on alternative precisely. And it is right now being directed by precisely Mr. Bashkut Tunçak. But right now you're having, and I really want to thank you, Mrs. Harriman, because I know that you have at this moment in TURI a very important meeting with a number of experts, and which of course keeps Bashkut Tunçak away from our discussion. But I want to thank you for having taken the time to get away from this very important expert meeting you're having and to spend this hour with us. So, Mrs. Harriman, the floor is yours to present us the work which is done by TURI in promoting alternatives in the field of toxics.
Thank you. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
All right. So yeah, Bashkut is now our director, and he brings a wealth of experience and knowledge from his previous position, and that is definitely helping us move forward. The Toxics Use Reduction Act is a state law in the Massachusetts and the U.S. that we work with businesses and communities to reduce their use of toxic chemicals. The law was passed back in 1989, so it's been around quite a while. And just to mention, labor was involved in crafting that law back then. And in fact, they did talk about a just transition a lot. And I'm not sure if we've achieved that, but we have certainly tried. One of the basic objectives of the law is there is a right to a safe and healthy work environment. There's a right to know what chemicals you're using in your facility, in your workplace, and in your community. And TURA requires businesses that use over a certain level of listed toxic chemicals to report their use to the state annually, and that information is publicly available on our website. It also requires them to pay a fee, which goes to support the agencies that then help them to find safer alternatives and reduce their use. It also has them every other year complete a TUR plan, a toxics use reduction plan. So that plan does not require them to make any changes, but it does require them to assemble a team, including line workers, and to then evaluate what their opportunities might be and what their options could be for reducing their use, including substitution of safer alternatives. So another note is that Massachusetts has mostly chemical users and processors and not many basic chemical feedstock manufacturers. And I think the just transition looks a little bit different depending on the profile of the kinds of companies you have. We have mostly the users. They would love to find safer alternatives wherever they can in general. In terms of the progress in Massachusetts, we have just since 2007, we started measuring since way back, but more recently, since 2007, we have something like 62% reduction in chemical use. So we're still making progress even after all this time. It's a lot of low-hanging fruit early on, but there are still definitely gains to be made. You had asked earlier when we were chatting to say something about the challenges and barriers to adopting safer alternatives. So just mentioning first that some of the drivers and incentives that we see that are really important, certainly government restrictions and regulations play a huge part The EU has done really well at providing many of those drivers for our companies in Massachusetts. The other thing that the government restrictions do is they provide a level playing field for all manufacturers. And that's really important when it comes to the workers and that just transition as well. If you have one facility company doing it and another not, that creates issues. So there's all sorts of other drivers and incentives. Certainly having evidence from a trusted source is something that Turi tries hard to provide and tries to get our companies who have success to then take that success and spread the word. Because the companies trust other companies in general. And so trying to make sure that that communication happens is definitely key to having adoption happen. Some of the challenges and barriers that we see, certainly there's a lot of financial ones. There's a huge established technology and investment in what they already use and what they know works. They often have limited capital, especially smaller firms. We provide grants to companies in Massachusetts to try to get them over the hump if they're trying out something new that hasn't necessarily been proven. One of the other interesting things we've discovered recently is that the standards and specifications, which are built around certain specific chemistries, provide a real barrier. So that has been absolutely true when it comes to PFAS. It's also been true for our military specs when it comes to halogenated solvents. Those specs are built around those chemistries, and it's really difficult to get those things changed. Those specifications change at a very, very slow pace. And we're certainly dealing with that now in terms of hexavalent chromium, in terms of, again, halogenated solvents, and definitely in terms of PFAS. And I'm sure that you are as well. Some of the other issues are it's hard to get their priority to pay attention to the toxic chemicals. So they have a lot on their plate. Most workers now have many jobs all at once. There isn't one person that's just dealing with this. And one of the things we found is that having a champion in the facility, and that can be the line workers, it can be the environmental health and safety person, or it can be management. Somebody really needs to champion this effort. And when that happens, then the chances of success are far greater. One other issue has been that it's sometimes hard to tell whether a new alternative is safer. And we try really hard to avoid regrettable substitutes, but it's a concern when there isn't information about new alternative chemistries. And we certainly don't want to be heading them in a direction where they then have adopted something and find that they then have to go back and refigure the whole thing again. So I think I'll just leave it at that. We have a lot of experience at Turi, and certainly a lot of that is shared on our website, and maybe during the discussion, some specific examples would be helpful. But
Great. Well, thank you very much, Liz, for all of these information. I think it gives us a wide view of all of the challenges we have if ever we do want to have a just transition. Thank you for reminding us that the word of just transition was already used much earlier, but as has been basically made public through the question of climate change, we perhaps have forgotten that. So thank you for this very useful reminder. Talking about the labor sector, we're very happy to have with us the main organization, the main international organization, which is active in this field for the labor sector. So let me turn now to our representative from ILO, from the Occupational Safety and Health Team, Hauschka Gradzik. I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly. Please correct me if that was not the case. So we know how important the ILO is through its conventions, but also through the rules, and also through the programs it has, which brings together not only the workers, but also the employers, and of course the states. And after what we just heard about the obstacles and the barriers, but also the drivers, what is your take in ILO, and how do you see that on the basis of your own experience?
Thank you very much for the introduction. It's really a pleasure to be here with all of you. And thank you so much to the Geneva Environment Network for inviting the ILO. Yes, absolutely. I'll dive straight into the point about international labor standards. First of all, just to say that the ILO was created already back in 1919 with the idea to create normative instruments to protect workers from hazardous chemicals. The very first instrument was already created in 1921, in fact, on white lead to protect workers during a time of rapid industrialization. So now just going into a bit, I wanted to follow up on what Marcus said about the first workers being on the first line for chemicals exposures. We know that workers, in fact, do, yes, face the brunt of chemical exposures. We know that 1 billion workers are exposed in their workplace. More than 1 million die from these exposures. Others suffer lifelong disabilities. And I think what's critical to mention here is that workers don't just die from chemical accidents, they die from diseases. A majority of the deaths are caused by diseases inflicted by chemicals. Classic, what we say, chemicals that have been around for decades, asbestos, silica, heavy metals, but also the new generation of chemicals, as Liz mentioned, PFAS, endocrine disrupting chemicals, a whole host of new chemicals that we also need to pay attention to. And what is most significant in this discussion is that hazardous chemicals not only threaten the health of workers, but they also threaten our broader aims of decent work and social justice for all. And this is why particular attention must really be paid for chemicals management. So when we talk about the just transition and what this means for chemical workers, we have to be very aware that there is an importance to promote, of course, toxics elimination and substitution. Using the ILO's proven approaches, hierarchy of controls, enhanced risk assessment, there is a huge opportunity to replace hazardous chemicals with greener processes. But what we don't talk about so often is, in fact, the greater risk that some changes in the way that we move towards a just transition can harm workers. In moving to more carbon neutral societies, there are new processes, new work materials, new work tasks that come about that we don't always have the proper risk assessment for. A few key examples are the life cycle of solar panels, how many heavy metals are included in solar panels, and how workers are exposed at every step from extraction to assembly to the big issue of e-waste and disposal. We also have the issue of the huge need for cobalt in rechargeable battery electrodes and the potential OSH risks that we see coming out of cobalt mining. The use of mercury in compact fluorescent light bulbs. I mean, what's so important here is that we're talking about the whole cycle of chemical use in the just transition. So where are we moving towards? Greener processes, but workers need to be protected at every step of the way. And I think that's a crucial part of this discussion that we don't always talk about. So what the ILO promotes for these situations is enhanced and integrated risk assessment at all levels, both at the national policy level, but also at the workplace level. What we're seeing often is this drive to move greener substances and greener work processes to the consumer. So we move from laboratory to the consumer, not always realizing that the people that are producing these new products are being exposed. And we don't always have that risk assessment at the policy level and also at the workplace level to properly protect workers. So what we really see at the ILO is we can move towards sound chemical management globally, but within a just transition, with our aim being, one, to protect workers from chemical substances, and two, making sure that we green that economy in a way that is the most inclusive way possible, creating decent work opportunities, but also making sure that we have social justice for all. I would like to talk more about also the importance of international labor standards, as Yves mentioned, and the importance of having that normative organization as someone like the ILO to underpin where we're going. The point about international labor standards is that they have a strong supervisory mechanism. So this is the teeth. This is really the teeth of the ILO. We do have numerous voluntary initiatives on chemical management, but we do know that our labor standards are tried, tested, really offer the golden standard for the workplace. Liz mentioned the importance of the new paradigm of having a safe and healthy working environment as a fundamental principle right at work. Of course, this relates to Convention 155 and Convention 187. All member states now have an obligation to ensure that workplaces are safe and healthy. And I want to highlight here that these conventions, as well as our other broader conventions on chemicals, provide very important provisions that can be used to protect workers exposed to chemicals in the just transition. Things like the principle of prevention, using the hierarchy of controls, risk assessment, having an established framework for the rights and responsibilities of different constituent groups, whether they're governments, employers, or workers. Now, in addition to Convention 155 and 187, yes, these are our fundamental conventions now, but it's also very important to leverage the existing labor standards we have on OSH and chemicals. We have dozens, and they're often left out of these discussions, but they really offer that normative approach. So I want to highlight Convention 170, our all-inclusive convention on all chemicals, existing and new, our Convention 174 on major industrial accidents, and then our numerous sectoral conventions that we also have that look at specific sectors and chemical use within them. Agriculture, huge sector for pesticide exposures, the mining sector, the construction sector. We also have our risk-specific conventions. So we have conventions specifically looking at carcinogenic chemicals, carcinogenic exposures at the workplace, a specific convention on asbestos, which we know is the leading killer of workers when it comes to chemical exposures. So leveraging these normative standards is really an important tool moving forward in our just transition. I would like to highlight as well that we are entering a very exciting time, that we will be soon looking at developing a new standard to complement Convention 170, to be able to tie in the new emerging trends in the world of work, whether that's climate change, just transition, new chemical mixtures. So we're really looking forward to that process and look forward to working with stakeholders all around the world to support us in this process. And to close, I want to highlight the point that we're really moving towards social justice eventually. That's where we want to go. We are talking about health and safety of workers. We're talking about greening the economy, but our ultimate goal, in fact, is social justice for all. Decent work opportunities, ensuring that we have everlasting systems in place to guarantee that social justice. And so now facing this multi-crisis from chemicals, from climate change, this is really the moment where the ILO can offer the strong spirit we have of social dialogue and bringing in governments, workers, and employers on an equal footing in order to discuss and to develop the most important standards for the future. So thank you very much, and looking forward to our next presentations and the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Halshka. Really very, very interesting presentation and very clear. I look forward to coming back on that because I have a number of questions myself, and I think it echoes also some of the elements that were presented by Liz Harriman just before. So I'm looking forward to these exchanges. But before we do that, we definitely would like now to have a look at how things are happening in the field. What is the experience from the field? And we have the privilege to have with us Repan Chowdhury, who is the Secretary General from the Bangladesh Free Trade Union Congress. Thank you very much, Repan, for being with us. And so I'll just directly give you the floor so that you can share with us your experiences and your views on these issues.
Thank you very much for inviting me to be part of this interesting conversations today on the subject matter. And as we all know that chemicals are part of our daily lives. Some chemicals are manufactured for specific use, while others are unwanted products of various process, and some are of natural origins. Harmful exposures may occur through breathing, drinking, eating, or contact. So we see that chemical hazards can be found at the workplace, in water or in the soil, and can cause a large variety of diseases. Many more diseases such as mental behavior, neurological disorders, deserves pregnancy outcomes, contracts, or asthma could be prevented by removing chemical exposure. We have already heard from other previous two speakers the numerous burden of these chemical exposures, and it relates to the working conditions. And by these times, we heard of the ILO estimates about 2.3 million women and men around the world succumbed to work-related accidents or diseases every year. This corresponds to over 6,000 deaths every 6,000 deaths every single day. And it is also we all aware that according to the new ILO 2021 reports, every year the 1 billion workers are exposed to hazardous substances, including pollutant, dust, vapors, fumes in the working environment. And many of these workers lose their lives following such exposures. Disease related to work cause most deaths among workers, and hazardous substances alone are estimated more than 500,000 deaths a year. So we must also consider the additional burden that workers and their families face from non-fatal injuries resulting in disability, deliberating chronic diseases and other health sequelae that unfortunately in many cases remain invisible. So all deaths are preventable and must ensure safe and healthy workplace for all. And the workers at the chemical sector in particular needs to strategically engage in various areas in order to minimize the adverse effect of chemicals. Workers have a needs for rights to information about the chemical they use at the work, and considering that it is essential for them to prevent or reduce incidents of chemically reduced illness, chemically induced injuries at work. So effective and evidence-based systems for sound management of chemical needs to be implemented at both national workplace level as a matter of urgency in order to protect workers, their families, and wider communities. So workers need to have a better access to training information to better understand chemical use in their workplace, find opportunities for using safer chemicals, engage with their employers through the process of identifying, evaluating, and transitioning to safe alternative. Therefore, the just transition is essential to move for sustainable production. And sustainable developments, we believe that three dimensions, economic, social, and environmental, are interrelated of equal importance and must be addressed together. And it is we believe that addressing a just transition to sustainable production is critical to safeguard against unintended impacts of workers, communities, health, and livelihood. Therefore, this priority is recognized in three agreed texts, including the COP27 work program on just transition and under Sharm el-Sheikh implementation plan November 22. On energy, these implementation plans notes recognize that unprecedented global energy crisis underlined the urgency to rapidly transform energy systems to be more secure, reliable, and reliant, including by accelerating clean and just transition to renewable energy during these critical decades of actions. So we also see the other agreed language on just transition can be found in the ILO guidelines for just transition towards environmentally sustainable economies, societies for all in 2015, and the role of social dialogue and tripartism in a just transition towards environmentally sustainable economies and societies for all in the ILO policy brief in August 22. So in conclusion, I like to stress here that the right to safe and healthy work is a fundamental human rights and essential to decent work, and an existing UN priority recognized in SDG goal number 8. And in December 22, International Labour Organization member states, representative organization of the employer and trade unions at the ILO International Labour Organization agreed by consensus to include right to a safe and healthy working environment in the ILO Declaration, Fundamental Principles and Right at Work. This means 187 states of the ILO have now committed to promoting health and safety, a safe workplace as a fundamental rights. So, and also here we this binding there is a need right at the moment. There is a discussion going on in the SICOMS, and we believe that to develop a new international instruments. So this binding commitment to ongoing efforts to improve condition must be recognized in the SICOM, and its normative measures prevent the chemical and waste. So I'll stop here. If any for further questions or anything, I'll be happy to answer. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your contribution and very relevant information. Before we get to exchange it among us, I know that Marcus or Anna had a very small specific question.
Well, thank you very much, Yves. I was quite intrigued, and well, first of all, thank you for the very insightful presentations. I was quite intrigued, Gasik, by your point about negotiations of a new standard in relation to climate. This, in a way, mirrors and relates very closely to the report, thematic report I presented to the Human Rights Council on Tuesday on the integration, the need for integration between decarbonization, detoxification strategies. I mean, much more could be said, but I was hoping that I would ask you if you could take a minute to further elaborate on that process, and what is it that you think the organization is trying to achieve with it. So yeah, thanks for that.
Yes, thank you very much, Marcus. Let me specify that the new standard that I'm speaking about is about chemicals management. It is indeed about chemicals management, the idea being that our standard review mechanism, which is part of our strong supervisory system, reviewed all of our chemical instruments, because we have so many, in fact, dating back from 1921. And a decision was made to consolidate new areas of work when it comes to chemicals management since 1990, which is when Convention 170 came about, with the idea of creating something complementary to Convention 170 in the form of an instrument. What that instrument will be has not yet been decided by our governing body and by our constituents. It will be shortly. We're looking forward to that. But when I mentioned just transition, we can imagine that because of the changing world of work trends, climate change being a top concern of all of our constituents, that just transition will have to figure a way into this new instrument. We don't know exactly how. That's up to our constituent discussions. But we must be aware of what has changed in the last decades when it comes to chemicals management, when it comes to how chemicals interact with different environmental concerns. And so we really look forward to having those discussions and seeing how to integrate just transition into that instrument.
Thank you for that. And also a question, I know that you're going to have to leave because you also have other meetings on your side at the ILO, and we're all juggling with our different schedule. But I wanted also to know, because Ripon very rightly mentioned a number of important events, like, for example, the coming next week's International Conference on Chemical Management, the 5th one. Where the special rapporteur will be, Marcos Solana will be also participating too. And I was wondering, how is the ILO, I'm sure the ILO is active and looking at this very, very closely. And I was wondering, how are we able to articulate correctly this so that we don't all act, which is a bit the problem we all have, in our own silos, sometimes with exactly the same issues, with the same will and the same legal background, but we still act independently, each one in our own silo.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a fantastic question, and I actually didn't come to it in my presentation, but really the importance of this multi-sectoral engagement, because we know that chemical exposures are not at all limited to one sector. We know here that environmental health is public health, is occupational health. They all overlap. And we need to be working together with our different stakeholders. So the ILO plays a very critical role in ICCM 5. That's also why I need to run. We're all in the midst of having meetings and traveling to Bonn. But the ILO has engaged our labor sector constituents. That means we are bringing our ministries of labor that are directly responsible for developing OSH management systems at the national level, and then making sure that they trickle down to the workplace level, making sure that our employers' representatives are there and that are aware of this new framework coming out, and also our workers' representatives. So we're very pleased that we will have our tripartite structure, not only here in Geneva when we have our governing bodies and our labor conference, but we'll be bringing them to Bonn, and we'll be really having this broad discussion from World of Work stakeholders. So we warmly invite anyone who'll be coming to ICCM 5 to the ILO events, which will take place on Tuesday and Wednesday.
Thank you very much. And just one question also before you run away. I'm using you at most of it. But it was also what Repon has said about, very rightly so, and I'll come back to Repon afterwards on this also, but the mention of the just transition at COP27. What is your perspective? We're going to have again a new COP in Dubai, COP28 at the end of the year. How do you see the articulation between these different conferences? And again, with, how do we avoid the silos there?
How do we avoid the silos? Yes, exactly. Well, I think that the fundamental concept that we keep trying to repeat is that human health is at the center of all of this. We need environmental health considerations. Of course, we're talking about just transition, greening the economy, but at the end of the day, it is whether we will be able to survive on this planet or not, and whether workers will be safe, whether the most vulnerable populations will be safe. And so the heart of the matter is really the human rights approach that we see. And so we're very grateful to be able to link the idea of a safe and healthy working environment to that human rights approach, to say that workers' rights are human rights, and that the heart of this issue, whether we're in Bonn or we're going to COP28, that we're talking about the health of human beings, which is central to all, and the underpinning really of all of the discussions.
Let me turn to Repon before I'll come back to Liz, but let me turn to Repon because a bit in the same line of the question I've raised before, you very rightly, Repon, in your statement, talked about COP27 and the just transition. I was wondering, how do you use these elements? And you've mentioned also the ICCM 5. How do you use these elements in the work that you're doing in Bangladesh at the national level? I mean, that this has an echo, that helps you in the work you're doing, that it helps convincing and doing the struggles you're doing in your country, or what could be done in order to help you more for the work you're doing at the national level?
So for the case of Bangladesh, we are actually advocating at the national level to exactly reeling the message that in the Paris Agreement in the preamble says the importance of just transitions for the workers, and also the decent jobs in the climate actions at the national level. So therefore, we are advocating at the national level to exactly to address those issues in the nationally determined document and the national adaptation policy and programs for Bangladesh to address the just transition. And that the just transition means we are asking for effective participation of the workers in the national dialogues, effective social protections, effective training and retraining. All these things are addressed in the national program and actions in the environmental part of the country scenario. So therefore, a strong dialogue is very essential, and we are advocating for that, and we are fighting for that to inclusion of the just transition in the national policy framework and a program of action in terms of climate actions. And this similar approach is also many trade unions in the Asian countries are now trying to replicate, so that we can have a better just transition in all aspects of the climate actions that actually covering by the workers and vulnerable communities in so on a better protected ways from the right-based angles.
Here. I want also to thank a comment we had online from the unions saying that they agree and the ILO's fundamental rights include the occupational health and safety, which are human rights, and that they are also included in the ILO guidelines on just transition. So thank you very much for this reaction and online directly from some of the unions who are with us today. Liz, I'd like to turn to you now, because it's quite interesting to see the work that we're trying to do here in Geneva with the international organizations, all of the human rights bodies, the ILO that we just heard. I was wondering, on your side, with the work that you are doing in trying to promote these alternatives, trying to bring the industry and the workers to do precisely a just transition, how useful, how much can you use what we're doing, and perhaps what would be the request or questions or ideas you'd like to share with us so that we can be more useful for the work that you are doing at your level?
Yeah, that's a big question. I'm fascinated by the discussion, and we don't have a lot of connection to ILO and some of those things, and yet they are in fact setting the global standards that we are then interacting with. And so that they're hugely important. They are very foundational for what's going on around the planet, and that always comes back. It's a global economy, and there's no company in Massachusetts that's somehow isolated from that economy. So it makes a difference what's happening in Bangladesh and around the world. I think one of the things that we're thinking about as we look far forward are we going to end up redesigning our chemical systems and our energy systems in the process of trying to save the planet and save humanity and all the other creatures? And if we redesign those chemical systems, is there going to be more decentralization and more indigenous kinds of approaches to the way we make products and use the resources of our planet? I also think we have some basic technical challenges in terms of safer chemicals and in terms of our energy systems. The climate change is a huge, huge problem, obviously. And many of the solutions that we're looking at make a lot of use of toxic chemicals, from PFAS, fluorinated chemicals, to rare earth metals, et cetera. I don't think that we have done a good job at thinking far enough forward to how do we transition to energy systems that are then protective of climate and also don't introduce just, a world of problems around the toxic chemical side.
Thank you very much, Liz, for these reactions and these comments. Redesigning our chemical and energy system, and you're putting the two together, which is quite interesting, and probably that's the way we should be formulating it. So with such a question and a target, it's easy for me now to turn to you, Marcus, as a special rapporteur. How do you see the work that you're doing as a special rapporteur and the work that we're trying to do in the field of chemicals here in the UN system? How do you see this role in precisely trying to redesign the chemical system?
Yeah, that's a big question. Thank you very much, Yves, and thanks to all who have taken the floor with such interesting comments. One of the guiding principles in the work of the mandate is the issue of prevention of exposure to hazardous substances, whether it's chemicals, whether it's wastes, whether it's intentional or unintentional. This focus on prevention, one way of carrying it forward is precisely to go in the upstream and the design of systems that then enable for practices to be designed in a way that do not result in exposure. And then come individual facilities and sectors, and then the bigger picture, the issues of the global toxification of the planet. So that's one approach of having an understanding of the relationship between exposure to hazardous substances and the adverse effects on the enjoyment of several internationally protected rights. A second approach certainly is on the basis of science. and science can be contested. So in that sense, it's not a monolithic, but it is certainly an objective measure of knowledge that should not be discarded. It's not the only source of human knowledge, but it's certainly a key to bridging the big distance between regulatory measures and what is the best available scientific evidence. In the work of the mandate, there are various issues that are directly related to this question of just transition and prevention. So if looking at a couple examples, last year I presented a report to the Human Rights Council on small-scale mining and mercury, and one of the key points there is precisely the transition towards mercury-free technologies. Some of that may include different chemistries, so in that sense your question of the redesign, but others may simply be technological and innovation and then be mechanical in that sense. So production systems, they form a broad, complex set of issues. It's not one or the other. There's even a continuum. As we know, small-scale mining is the largest source of mercury releases and emissions to the environment, and they're not adequately addressed by the Minamata Convention on Mercury. So the just transition in this sector is key, because if the miners themselves don't see alternatives and they're not supported in this transition, well, the problem simply won't get resolved. The problem doesn't get resolved with the government passing a decree. The problem gets resolved when the people that work in the mines have the opportunities to transition to mercury-free technologies. And that's I think relates directly to this issue of just transition. And a second example that I think is worthwhile mentioning in the work of the mandate in relation to your question, Eve, is on shipbreaking. So I had the opportunity, and we'll talk more about this tomorrow, but I did have an opportunity to conduct a visit to the International Maritime Organization. The Hong Kong Convention is going to enter into force on ship recycling after many years since its negotiation. And one of the points there is that this instrument brings in standards for the certification of recycling facilities, among various other measures, several of which can be quite positive. But the instrument doesn't eliminate the practice of beaching, which, as some of you may be familiar, is running the ship in high tide, and then when the low tide comes, workers come with their torches to dismantle the ship almost as a cottage industry. As a recent case in the courts of England held, it is not a question of if workers will be harmed or die, but it's more of an issue of probability of counting numbers. And that's a really unfortunate situation, of course, for the mostly migrant workers in the shipyards in Bangladesh and India, where the beaching practices take place. The transition here is often regarded as a loss of comparative advantage, because why these yards are attractive in many ways to the shipping industry at the end of the life cycle of the vessels is precisely because the costs of adequate shipbreaking are externalized on the workers and on the environment. And so the transition towards having appropriate technologies to properly recycle ships, all of that needs investment. And that's again where international cooperation comes in. It may be that cooperation for shipbreaking can be channeled through the Hong Kong Convention on Ship Recycling. It's a big question there, but I think the question is more broad. I mean, that's a specific example that illustrates the point. The bigger point is that just transition in every country requires support. It doesn't happen otherwise, just because it is a good idea. That support may come from industry associations. It may come from the government, or in many instances, it needs to come from international assistance and cooperation. And I want to underline that point, that international cooperation and just transition within that is, I would say, an imperative in the road to realizing what has been referred to several times as the fundamental right at work for a safe and healthy working conditions.
Thank you very much, Marcus, for this these elements. As we were mentioning the shipbreaking issue and the shipping industry, perhaps Repan Chaudhary from Bangladesh would like to comment on that.
Yeah, what Marcos have already stated, for the case of Bangladesh, this is reality, and we have seen every year a large number of shipbreaking workers actually died in the workplace due to unsafe working conditions. And also we have seen how the local community and the workers' health been compromised because of the unsafe management of the chemicals and that in the ship dismantling process, and that has indulged the industry to have more unsecured working conditions to continue and continuously damaging the local environment and risking the life of the workers due to lack of low enforcement of the labor law and environmental law in the workplace. So therefore, it is very important to have the national regulations are there to well enforced, and that therefore, and in this context, the government's commitment is very crucial, and the fundamental principles of rights at work never be established if there is no solid commitment from the government sides to enforce and implement those agreed the international tools and national regulations to ensure the safe and healthy workplace a reality. So in the case of Bangladesh, shipbreaking worker is one of the examples where we can see a big vulnerability and the loss of lives and the compromise due to the industry for constantly engaging in the unsafe working conditions. And also, so therefore, it is very important to have the new international regulations in line can be well enforced and mandatory in nature, so that can be translated in the national actions, and national governments can more comply with the international instruments to follow in futures. And our pathway need to be in that directions to secure the life and livelihood of the workers in the industry, like in shipbreakings and other hazardous industry. Those are a reality in Bangladesh, and other countries in the South Asian region. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Repan. Let me turn to Liz. We're getting to the end of the hour that we have for this discussion. And so, Liz, would you have any final concluding remarks or elements you'd like to share with us?
I have a question. So what is it that we in the small state of Massachusetts in the US can be doing to try to push forward all of these really important issues? I didn't even know shipbreaking existed until you just talked about it.
Yeah, I can take a quick stab at that. And it is, Liz, to continue doing what you're doing. Turi has done an incredible job at operationalizing what are sometimes abstract or more general discussions. I recall last year being in the jury selecting for the awards for the future policy, and one of them was precisely to Turi because of its work in making the connections that make these concepts a reality. So it's one thing to talk about just transition as a concept. It is another to go out to the field, connect with the companies, deal with specific products, identify technologies, identify opportunities, and make it happen. And so I in that sense, it's just continuing doing what you're doing. Thank you for your work.
We will try to do that and try to keep telling the story and have like Bashkut bring that story back to the rest of you.
Thank you very much, Liz. And actually, you made a quite important point, quite a few important points, a number of important points in your presentation. But one of that struck my mind and said it's interesting to see how we organize our discussions when you were saying that in Massachusetts, you don't have a lot of chemical manufacture. So the type of profile of work that you have to do will be probably very different to a number of the elements that Repan has to face in Bangladesh. And these elements need to be taken more in consideration in the way we formulate our own elements, recommendations, and guidelines on our side, because sometimes indeed they are very general, and there's still room for improvement there. So I think it was very, very useful comments. And also, in conclusion, I wanted to thank Rory O'Neill, who has been following and very active in the discussion. For those who are in the room and who are unable to follow the chat, just to share one or two of his very relevant and useful comment. And when he was saying is, as tourists say, you can't have safety in one country. We have to ensure high standards that these high standards are supported globally. We currently have export of hazardous, including a double standard where rich nations manufacture and export chemicals banned in their home nation, which is one of the issues on which the special rapporteur has been very active and continues to be very active. And that could be also one of the outcomes of ICCM 5, where Rory O'Neill is playing a very, very important role. Rory O'Neill was also saying that there's an excellent Australian example mentioned by Marcus or Elena. After pressure from unions, Australia has an asbestos eradication agency and law, a tighter silica occupational exposure limit. So, I mean, we can see these elements, and it's really interesting because sometimes, a bit like you were saying, Liz, we're not aware of the impact of what we're doing, we're doing at the local level actually is inspiring others, or what we're doing here and we're wondering where does it end. Well, it has had an impact on the ground. So it's really interesting to have this type of discussions. And Rory O'Neill has also highlighted how much we need to work on the supply chain. Because none of the system is totally isolated from the others. And that's where all of these exchanges needs to be strengthened. I really want to thank, I know our friend from ILO had to leave because of other commitment, but she really made it sure that she would be able to participate to this discussion. And I think I really want to thank her and thank all of you for participating to these dialogues. We need more of that. And let me turn now for a very final word to Marcus Salana before the closing of the final closing of this discussion. Marcus?
Thank you, Yves. I'll be very brief, but I did want to react to Rory O'Neill's point in Australia because it touches upon something that I think is worth highlighting here. Hashka spoke about occupational health and safety, and she also spoke about the various conventions under the International Labour Organization that talk about the right to a safe and healthy conditions. But it's one thing to have standards, and another related is to have a rights-based approach. Management standards do not necessarily coincide and exhaust a rights-based approach. And I think that the example brought in by Rory O'Neill is exactly on this point. Australia has managed as a result of the organized work of labor unions, to have a protective standard on silica dust. Silicosis is a very serious disease. Exposure to silica dust, PM 2.5, is a hazardous occupational exposure, health and safety, no doubt. But there are many infringements still, because reality doesn't change by decree. Reality is broader than governmental decrees, as we well know. And so in various states in Australia, it is only the regulator that can pursue breaches of and non-compliance with the occupational standard. It is not the labor union, it is not the individual employer. And so there we see the difference between a standard and management, occupational health and safety, with a rights-based approach. A rights-based approach would afford access to remedies to the individual victim, that suffers as a result of non-compliance with a management standard. That is still the road that needs to be traversed. There's still a long ways to making a rights-based approach a reality, also in regards to ILO conventions. And that, I think, underlies the fundamental importance of what has been achieved at the ILO, of recognition of a healthy and safe environment, not just as management and conventions, which are of course important and critical, but as a fundamental right and principle at work. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think we could not have a better conclusion, and I think we can all go away from this meeting. And for all of those who are going to ICCM 5 next week, you'll be able to meet again with the special rapporteur because he's coming over there. You'll probably have the opportunity to meet our friend Rory O'Neill over there. So I wish for all of those going to ICCM 5 all the best. We need a successful ICCM 5. And for all of those who are not going to ICCM 5, keep an eye on what's going to come out of there. Act at your own level, at the national level, to make sure that we send a very clear message to all of the decision makers. Thank you very much for your participation in this discussion. This is the last event of the Geneva Toxic Free Talk for today. We will have tomorrow 3 other events, very, very important, and we'll have also the opportunity to talk about the report of the Special Rapporteur on the International Maritime Organization, which will cover some of the issues that we've been talking about today, but more focused on the IMO. We'll have also, with the Permanent Mission of Chile, a very important discussion, and we're very happy to have already with us Professor Lagos, who will be intervening tomorrow in the integration of detoxification and decarbonization, which is the matter of the report to the current session of the Human Rights Council by the Special Rapporteur. And we'll end on something that I know that Special Rapporteur is also very keen to push forward, which is the right to science. One of his previous reports in the future negotiation of the Science Policy Panel on chemicals and pollution. So we all look forward to seeing all of you who can, here in the room or online, to these different events of the Geneva Toxic Free Talks. Many thanks to all of you, and again, a great thank to the team from the Geneva Environmental Network, without whom this would not have been possible. Thank you.
Thank you.